If you keep swapping out the old planks of a ship for newer ones, at which point do you have a new ship entirely? Maybe the ship of Theseus can apply to cities as well. If a city's been destroyed and rebuilt from ash and rubble, is it really even the same place? Maybe there's no easy answer, but it's a testament to human resilience that we're able to do that at all, as is the case with the following cities. Number 9. Jerusalem, 70. You don't have to be a student of history to know that Jerusalem has been the epicenter for religious struggles for thousands of years. From the days of the Old Testament to the Crusades to the modern day, the city is constantly under siege, being sacked or split down the middle. Perhaps the most infamous such event occurred just a few decades after the life of Jesus of Nazareth. In 66 AD, Jewish rebels seized control of the area from Roman occupiers, who unsurprisingly didn't take too kindly to this. Emperor Titus marched down with around 70,000 men and besieged the holy city for 4 brutal months right around Passover before storming it, burning the Second Temple and slaughtering the remaining defenders. You can still see the Arch of Titus in Rome today, a symbol of Jewish diaspora, the decentralization of Jewish culture after the destruction of its longtime capital, commemorating this brutal victory. Number 8. Lisbon, 1755. There was widespread speculation that God had personally overseen the destruction of Lisbon, Portugal, since the earthquake that ravaged it in 1755 fell on November 1st, All Saints' Day. As is often the case with earthquakes, a tsunami was fired off, leading to further destruction roughly 40 minutes after the quake, and fires soon broke out that quickly grew beyond the ability of the already stretched thin emergency services. They didn't have the Richter scale in 1755, but modern seismologists who can notably trace the origins of their field to efforts to study this particular disaster pin the quake at an enormous magnitude of 8.5 to 9. Given the weaker construction of the day and the lack of modern response services, the death toll of between 30 and 40,000 that's since been attributed to this disaster seems more or less in line with the data. Some estimates put the death toll closer to 100,000, but there's no way to be sure. Either way, the Great Lisbon earthquake had a profound effect on Portuguese politics, economics, and plans for future colonial expansion. Enlightenment philosophers throughout Europe struggled to rectify the carnage with their image of a benevolent god, leading to profound advancements in theological thought. When the city was rebuilt, far greater care was given to earthquake-resistant structures. Number 7. Chicago, 1876. As legend has it, Catherine O'Leary's cow knocked a lantern into some hay and started a small fire. By the time the city's 185 firefighters arrived at DeKoven Street, the fire had already consumed much of the block and was now raging towards the central business district, constantly strengthened by the city's numerous wooden buildings. The hope that the Chicago River and a recently burned area with little remaining fuel would act as a natural firebreak was dashed, as the area along the river contained numerous lumber yards, coal yards, barges and bridges, all of which were swept up in what was now a massive inferno barreling towards the heart of the city. The overheated air produced a tornado-like firewhirl that launched the flaming projectiles far and wide, adding to the blaze. The city waterworks soon burned to the ground, ruining the water mains and leaving the city with no options but to evacuate as many panicking residents as they could and wait for the fire to burn itself out. It did eventually, but not before 300 people were killed, 70 miles of road, 120 miles of sidewalk, 2,000 lampposts, and 17,500 buildings had been destroyed, resulting in $222 million in damages, a third of the city's valuation at the time. Number 6. St. Louis, 1876. Tornadoes generally strike more rural areas since the regions most prone to twister-spawning weather conditions tend to lack the major waterways along which cities are often built. St. Louis, Missouri, however, smack on the Mississippi, had the profound and unenviable distinction of being a dinner bell for funnel clouds. In the last century and a half, well over 100 tornadoes have struck the metropolitan area directly, causing widespread destruction and thousands of deaths. The 2 costliest twisters in American history have both struck this city. The most expensive of the 2, part of a larger outbreak, as is often the case, slammed into the eastern part of the city in May of 1896. Well before modern Doppler radar technology had been developed and before even rudimentary sirens. The local weather services had only predicted light thunderstorms for the afternoon. By the time barometric pressure plummeted and black-green cumulonimbus clouds appeared on the horizon, it was too late. A monster touched down in the middle of the city, then one of the country's largest, and proceeded to wreak havoc. At least 255 people were killed, more than 1,000 were injured, and as many as 12,000 buildings were damaged. Total estimates at the time exceed $10 million, which is about $4.5 billion today. Number 5. Galveston, 1900. The Wall Street of Texas, as the former capital of the Republic of Texas had once been nicknamed, is now most notable by far for the massive hurricane that brought it to ruin on September 8, 1900. The storm began off the west coast of Africa, gained steam as it headed towards the Caribbean, and grew into a monster by the time it hit the Gulf of Mexico. Although the storm's existence was known to the United States, words like tornadoes and hurricanes were discouraged to avoid public panic. Furthermore, trajectory updates from the Belen Observatory in Cuba, believed to be among the finest meteorological institutions at the time, were buried due to tensions rising from the Spanish-American War. Thus, the city of Galveston was woefully unprepared when the Category 4 monster made landfall there. The city was flattened, causing the 2020 equivalent of over $1 billion in damages, and between 6,000 and 12,000 people lost their lives. The most quoted figure is 8,000. This makes it, by quite a significant margin, the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. Number 4. San Francisco, 1906. San Francisco is currently facing a public housing crisis due to the out-of-control price of rent, but that's nothing compared to what happened to the city in 1906 when a 7.9 magnitude earthquake destroyed nearly 80% of the city's buildings, ending 3,000 lives and leaving as many as 300,000 people, roughly 75% of the city's population at the time, homeless. This particular slip of the San Andreas Fault had been coming for years, rattling the Pacific coast with impending foreshocks. But there's simply no way the public at the time, with 1906 detection methods, 1906 disaster relief systems, and buildings up to 1906 codes, could have adequately prepared for the quake that shook the city and several surrounding cities for 42 seconds at 5 in the morning on April the 18th. Notably, the shaking itself only caused about 10% of the damage that forced hundreds of thousands of survivors to live in tents for months and led to widespread rioting and looting as public services broke down. The other 90% was caused by numerous fires, themselves the result of ruptured gas lines. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in Californian history. Number 3. Warsaw, 1944. Neither the Germans nor their Soviet opponents on World War II's Eastern Front had invested in the long-range, four-engine bombers that the Western Allies had in abundance, which allowed the latter group to deliver unprecedented amounts of damage from the sky. So the cities that were crushed here were crushed with ground forces. There are exceptions like the August 1942 Stalingrad bombing, which immediately preceded the battle of the same name. But the destruction of Warsaw by the Nazis in late 1944 stands out even in a theatre of combat defined by a complete and total disregard for human life, property, and dignity. This wasn't the result of a conquering army acting out its bloodlust before officers regained control, since the city had already been occupied for roughly 5 years at this point. No, like most Nazi atrocities, the razing of Warsaw was premeditated and administered by the state, in this particular case to exact revenge on the Poles for their failed but costly August 1944 rebellion. While Stalin held his Red Army on the east bank of the Vistula and watched, the Nazis took forces desperately needed at the front and handed them the strategically worthless task of dismantling the Polish capital, along with its historically precious collection of medieval libraries and cathedrals, brick by brick. Roughly 90% of the city was razed to the ground with a combination of artillery, dynamite, and flamethrowers, a higher percentage than any other metropolitan area in the war. Number 2. Tokyo, 1945. Any of the cities that were bombed into oblivion during the Second World War would be fair game for a list like this, but lots of them, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden, etc., are mainly notable because of their destruction. So instead, we've decided to take this opportunity to discuss Operation Meeting House, the March 1945 US bombing raids against the Japanese capital. It wasn't the first assault against the city. The April 1942 Doolittle raid, which was only effective enough to serve as a propaganda win for the then struggling US, had that honor. But it was the deadliest by far. In fact, it was the deadliest bombing raid not just against Tokyo, not just of the Pacific War, and not just of World War II, but in all of human history. Yes, it even beats out the 2 atomic bombings that, along with the declaration of war against Japan by the USSR, brought the conflict to an end a few months later. There's a simple reason for this. The bombs used in Meeting House were incendiary devices which bring destruction and death not through a direct blast effect like most bombs, bombs, but instead by starting uncontrollable wildfires. The attack lasted less than 3 hours and involved fewer planes than many of the other mass raids that characterized the final years of the war, but it still razed eastern Tokyo to the ground and killed between 90 and 100,000 people and left more than 1 million homeless. In typical World War II fashion, the vast majority of the victims were innocent civilians. Emperor Hirohito later cited his post-bombing tour of the city as one of the main reasons. He later overruled his military council and decided to endure the unendurable and surrender. Number 1. Belgrade. Well, just constantly. You'd think that being situated along the fertile banks of 2 major commercial waterways and being the gateway between continents would be an envious position for any city. All regional trade would have to pass through its gates, which would result in immeasurable wealth, prestige, and power. Unfortunately, it also means that all invaders have to pass through town at least once too. Enter Belgrade, current capital of Serbia, formerly Yugoslavia, where the Danube meets the Sava. Europeans can't get to Turkey, and therefore Asia, without passing through, and Asians can't get to Europe without doing the same. So you can quickly see the problem here. Here's a quick rundown of its history. Early farmers were conquered by the Celts, who lost the area to Rome, who lost it to the Huns, who lost it to Rome again, who lost it to the Ostrogoths, who lost it to the Eastern Romans, who lost it to the Avars, who lost it to Attila the Hun, who lost it to the Byzantines, who fought the Avars, Hungarians, Gepids, and the Bulgarians for the place over the course of roughly 400 years. Later, armies from all 3 crusades passed through before the Serbian Empire took the land and lost it to the Hungarians. Then the Ottomans took it and destroyed it, enslaving its Christian inhabitants, and held the land for quite some time before both the Allies and the Central Powers fought ferociously over the territory in World War I. A few years later, the Nazis rolled into town with plenty of high-powered explosives before they lost it to the USSR, which collapsed and left the area to be ripped apart by the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, at which point it was bombed back into rubble by NATO. All in all, Belgrade has seen 115 wars and has been razed to ash not once, not 5 times, not 10 times, but 44 times. Maybe it's time to move somewhere peaceful, like Baghdad. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, why not check out a new channel I'm working on called Business Blaze? It's like this, except it's about business and it's a bit more laid back. So it's not really like this at all, but I'm linking to it below anyway. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for watching.